thank you all for the invitation to be here. So when I first got the invitation, I thought, by quick introduction, Scisphere is a startup. We're less than a year old. We're a US-based company, but a lot of our operations are in India. And when I say a lot, we're 18 people right now, so it's small. When I got this invitation, the first thing I thought is, gosh, this is nice because we are, we're a small company and we need to recruit. So, and then I saw the email from Subhashri with a PowerPoint that said, here's the format that you should speak with. And she said, you have to introduce yourself and talk about your career path and give people career advice. And I thought, gosh, then I had a wave of panic because I'm not sure I have a career path. But, and I sort of tell you, but I thought, okay, maybe I'll start with telling you what I've done and which will give you a sense of the genesis of this company and what it does. So I actually had a very circuitous path into science. I grew up in Madras, and my family was in textiles and banking. And I went off to the US to do my undergrad, where I did math, and was told, to come quickly back to the family business. So I finished my undergrad, and I did that. But while I was there, I thought, gosh, some of these science classes, I've taken introductory science classes as part of these requirements, and this seems kind of fun. So after 4 years in the textile industry, I said, this is not for me. And I needed to figure out what I wanted to do. But at that point, I didn't have any background in science. And so I thought, the only place that will take me is business school. So I went. I went back to the U.S. and I went to Kellogg and did my MBA. While I was there, there was a lot of flexibility in the program in the sense you could take a couple of classes outside of the business school. So I started doing a little bit of physics and neuroscience. And one of the things that completely changed the path for me was when I wanted to take an introductory neuroscience course, and I went to, because I was in the business school, I needed to get the signature of the professor. And so I went to his lab, and I found him in his lab, and he said, I was kind of looking around, and they had all this complicated electronic stuff, and these microscopes and lots of wires, and I got the signature, and I said, Nelson, what do you do here? So he said, do you want me to show you? So he took me and showed me the lab, and what they do, and I don't know how many of you are in neuroscience, but they do brain slices, recordings from neurons in slices of brain. So he said, look, we take the slice of brain tissue from the rat, and here's how we're doing it. And then we put it on this rig, and we can record activity from neurons. And for me, I was like, wow. So you're telling me this slice of brain is alive? And he says, yeah, it stays alive for about, if you do a good job with your dissection, it can stay alive for many, many hours. So to me, this kind of blew my mind. It was sort of this idea that you could take a piece of a brain outside of an organism and that it would continue to function. And what does that mean really? I mean, what does it mean to have a brain active outside the being? And the rat is dead. It's a carcass in a biohazard bag in the freezer. Or is it, and so, there's these sort of philosophical questions that arise. So what I proceeded to do during my years at business school was I would spend the evenings. So I had to share a rig with a graduate student who got precedence over the MBA. And I would go in at night and try to do some of these recordings from neurons. So at the end of, and I was quite awful at it, actually. I had, as you say in science, very bad hands. And there'd be others there who everything would work, and my tissue would look like a war zone. But nonetheless, I kind of persisted, and I had some good days. And at the end of that, he, Nelson Spruston was his name, and he said, I'll write you a recommendation if you want to go to graduate school. And at the time, I'd just finished my MBA, and I got a fancy MBA job which was at Bristol Myers Squibb in New Jersey. It was actually in marketing there. So I went over to New Jersey, and then meanwhile, I was trying to think about this, and I kept telling him, Nelson, but I don't have any of the prerequisites. You're supposed to have done all these like 10 courses, and I haven't done any of this. And he said, it doesn't matter, don't worry about it. So, and so I applied to graduate school while I was there, and I spent about a year working at Bristol Myers Squibb, first in marketing, and after the first 3 months, kind of found my way into a group called Strategic Scientific Planning, which was more on the business side of the pharmaceutical industry in Princeton. So meanwhile, I was sort of trying to figure out whether I would go and do a PhD in neuroscience. So I went. I went to do interviews at a few places, and when I was interviewing at Stanford, I know one of the faculty who was interviewing me. He said, "I've seen your application. You're from the business school. You know nothing about science." So, and I thought, gosh, this is not going very well. And in another interview, one of the faculty said, he said, you've been to the business school. You've been in business school and working in textiles, and why do you want to come here? And before I could answer, he answered it himself, and he said, because there's nothing like the thrill of discovery. And so I think that that was really for me, where the path of, if there is a path in this, changed. And I went to do a PhD in neuroscience at Stanford. And while I was there, one of the things I started working on was with dissociated neuronal cultures. So these cultures essentially, and again to me, this was just sort of extraordinary that you take neurons out of a mouse pup and put them in a dish, and they would start, you've basically severed off all their processes, and you're putting them in a dish, and suddenly they're growing back. And any of you in neuroscience here? Do you guys work with neuron cultures? Anyone? Yes. But maybe I can just show you a quick video of what that's like, because maybe it will be as exciting to you as it was to me. Let's see if this plays. So you can see, that they start extending their neurites in a dish, and they look for each other. Sometimes they retract. Sometimes they form a stable connection. And there's all this, and there's the constantly resculpting network. So there's all this stuff at play. And so, and then you come back after a few weeks, and you look in your dish, and there's this dense network of an activity coursing through it. And one of the things that I did there was basically looking at how what happens when you change the level of activity, or if you, let's say, block certain receptors, what happens to the way in which neurons respond. And one of the things I found was that, in fact, they qualitatively change quite substantially. So it's not just like a homeostatic change depending on how much activity is going on or how much inhibition or excitation there is, but there's an actual, sorry, we just turned this off now. I think it's just replay. So it's just, and so it's something actually qualitatively different happens. So at this point, I sort of came to the end of my PhD and thought, my gosh, I've spent all this time looking at the individual neuron, and somehow what matters to how the neuron behaves is this entire, all of these different aspects of the network, how it's communicating, how activity is flowing in the larger system. And I've spent all this time working at a cellular level, and I don't understand anything. And somehow there is something very, very different going on that is only at the that you can only get your head around at a systemic level. So that was the time when I met someone called Dietmar Plenz at the NIH, and what he was doing was he'd actually done this very, very extraordinary kind of feat in tissue engineering, I would say, where he was growing these 20-micron thick slices of cortex on a microelectrode array, but the thing was that you'd put down these the culture onto the array, and then the layers 2 and 3 of the cortex would grow. The cells were still migrating, and they would kind of grow out in a 2D configuration on top of the electrode array. So in a sense, it was like having a 2D brain in a dish. And they had, so they did that, and with a lot of, work on trying to get them to stay alive in an incubator and record activity from it. And they found something that they never expected, and they couldn't quite figure out what it was doing, because after a week or two, all of a sudden you would have this synchrony of activity, this kind of, with all this structure that they, were still trying to understand, but all the structure coming out of it, where you've got sort of these waves of activity that flow, that course through the network. And so this was kind of eerie to me, because in the culture we never saw, everything looked a little unintelligible, but here it seemed like there's all this structure coming out, and what does that mean? So I went there to do a postdoc, and it was a big switch for me, because it was going from more the cellular biology into something that much more system level, complex systems kind of thing. And so I hadn't been there very long, and my father fell ill. So this is sort of one of those life's circuitous paths, where he fell ill, and and then died some time after that. But during this period of time, I was doing a postdoc. I had just started, and fortunately for me, I could go, because a lot of it was analytical on the computer. I could take data, and I could come to India, and I would be here 2 months, and I would go back for 2 months, and then I would come here for 2 months. And but what happened in that period of time was my dad was supposed to have been retiring, because I told him that I'm not coming back. And somehow that he obviously hadn't expected to sort of have a stroke, and we hadn't expected that to happen, and for him to pass away at that time, because he was just 60. So I inherited a microfinance operation. I wasn't too happy about that, to say the least. So the microfinance, I don't know if all of you followed it at all, but basically it's giving small loans to people in rural areas in India. And we, and what I realized when I came down in the finance business, that, there's a lot of risk there, and we have bankers, and there's all this sort of, money has to be paid back, and paid back to bankers, and so on. So, so I had to learn some things very quickly. And actually, at the time when I started, one of the things I did was I was here at NCBS as a visiting scientist in Upi's lab, and thinking that I could kind of do both and continue to do science. I finished my postdoc in the first few years of up and down, and then I moved to India finally, because this company sort of had a point where we had to raise private equity, and the investor said, you can't be a scientist at the NIH, you got to come here, and you're going to fix this. So I said, reluctantly, I signed away 2 years of my life, and I said, but I'll be a visiting scientist at NCBS, and they said, fine. So, and then here I was supposed to come once a week, but that didn't quite work out too well, because it got quite hectic, because this was all based out of Madras. And, but one of the things that happened while I was there is, so, for the first few years, it was sort of, what the hell is this about? And I didn't want to do this. This is quite awful. And, but as I started thinking about it, one of the things I did was I set up a human dynamics lab. So if you think about it, so one of the things that, the question that I started to ask at that time was, what is progress, right? And microfinance was about this. I don't know if any of you followed some of this in 2006. Muhammad Yunus was given the Nobel Prize, and he was going to put poverty in the museum like a dinosaur, and so on. But this clearly, that was not going to happen. And so the question to me was really, is that the right question to be asking? And even as a scientist, if whatever you're doing, how do you think about what's the framework in which you're going to think about it? So so where does, this idea of where does progress come from? And in the interest of time, we know human beings have existed for 200,000 years, yet most of the progress has been in the last 150. And if you look at this and you sort of blow it up, you can see India is sort of under there. So the question really here was, what aspects of a system, if you think about the human systems, I'm not going to, that really, we are all, it's just an embedded system, right? We are systems of molecules that come together, atoms that come together into these complex macromolecules and ecosystems, which then come together in these, into cells, which form networks, which form organs. And, these organs essentially, like the human brain, that forms society, right? So if you think about it, society is really a network of neural networks. And, it's a nested network, a group of people talking to each other, which is, a network of brains, which is a network of neurons talking to each other, and so on. So each level has a different level of complexity. And when you come up to human beings, it's much more complex. So the question was really, what can we know about the brain? Knowing what we do about complex systems in general, be it the brain and how it behaves, or even how atoms interact to produce emergent properties, what is it about human society? Can we understand how human society is structured, and what are the kind of conditions and the kind of different things that really come together to create progress? So it's a very similar question to how do neurons come together to produce intelligence or cognition or thought. And so part of what we did in the microfinance company, because that kept me sane in a way, was to set up sort of a lab where we studied human systems and how people are laid out in space, and how information moves through, how these networks are structured, how different aspects of human ecosystems. And so that's really the genesis of where Scisphere comes from. And so I'll just tell you a little bit of what we're doing here in the company is basically what I call, sorry, I couldn't embed those videos. So it's basically what we call distributed contextual intelligence. So if you think about it, 500, it's not until 1800 that we hit a system of about 1 billion people. And if you think about where intelligence arises in the brain, it's in higher level organisms where there are a larger number of neurons in the system and greater kind of interconnectivity and so on. And so, it's a constantly resculpting, evolving ecosystem. And what we do is basically try to do the science of this and turn it into, bring insight and understanding into how systems behave, and bring that into analytical tools that can actually enable organizations and companies to make more intelligent decisions by having a more complex system or contextual view of the environment in which they operate. So a lot of it is, there's a lot of straightforward analytics that people have done in the big data world as well, but a lot of, sort of systems thinking of how, that we can take from how biological systems work or how matter works, and bring things together that we can actually enable, even for instance, as a user, the microfinance company that I run, where even a field staff should now, who's got a 12th pass degree, should be able to access it on an Android device and be able to take better decisions by having insight into how the ecosystem and contextual, the ecosystem around her or him is behaving. So that's what we do at Scisphere. And like I said, we're young. We haven't launched our product yet, but that should happen at the end of this year. And if there's any career advice, really, that I don't know if there's a lesson in the sort of winding path that I've taken, but I think it's more about find the problems that you want to work on, right? And the things that really that you want to solve, and then regardless of you'll find a way, a place to do that, and some, irrespective of what happens and how it happens, that there will be a way in which you can take that framework and that inquisitiveness and questioning and turn it into something regardless of where you go. So I guess that's just the message that, that's message I can give you, and that there is not, and maybe another being, there is not always only, and I think people have said this before, but while we have, there is no box really. The box is as he said before, the box is an illusion. That there are structures and predefined paths, but someone's created that, and the others are just waiting to be created, essentially. So, with that, I think I'll end. Thank you.